You're looking at soil that most gardeners would walk away from without a second thought. It's dry, compacted, and silent. When soil reaches this stage, it almost looks like it has turned into something else entirely. More like lifeless dust than the living foundation of a garden. If you push your fingers into it, the surface barely moves. There are no insects running across the top, no sign of moisture below, and definitely no earthworms working through the soil. For many people, this is the moment they assume the ground is finished. They imagine that nothing will grow here again without expensive fertilizers, bags of new soil, or complicated treatments. But the truth about soil is something most people never learn. Even when it appears completely dead, it is often not truly dead at all. It is simply asleep, waiting for the conditions that allow life to return. And that is exactly what I wanted to test here. Instead of replacing the soil or pouring chemicals into it, I decided to try something extremely simple, something gardeners used long before modern fertilizers existed. It's a dark liquid that forms naturally when organic materials break down. Most people see it and think it is waste, something to throw away or wash off. But hidden inside that dark liquid is something powerful. It contains the invisible life that healthy soil depends on. Bacteria, fungi, microscopic organisms, and dissolved nutrients that together form the foundation of a living ecosystem underground. So I took that liquid and poured it directly onto this patch of lifeless soil. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The liquid soaked into the surface and disappeared. The soil looked almost the same as before. Still dark, still quiet, still hard. If you had walked past at that moment, you might have thought the experiment failed instantly. But soil changes rarely happen on the surface first. They begin below, where a hidden world is constantly reacting to moisture, nutrients, and microscopic life. Within the first few hours, something subtle begins to change. The moisture spreads through the compacted particles of soil, softening areas that were once locked together. The microorganisms carried in the liquid begin to wake up and multiply, feeding on the tiny bits of organic material scattered throughout the ground. These organisms are the first workers in the long process of rebuilding soil. They break down material, release nutrients, and create the conditions that allow larger forms of life to return. After about 24 hours, the soil often begins to look slightly different. It may appear darker and a little more loose on the surface, but the real transformation is still happening, where you cannot see it yet. Beneath the surface, the environment is changing. The scent of decomposition and organic activity begins to spread through the soil, and that scent carries an important signal to creatures that live underground. Earthworms are incredibly sensitive to the conditions of soil. They can detect moisture, organic matter, and microbial activity from surprisingly far away. When soil is dry and lifeless, they avoid it completely because there is nothing there for them to eat. But when conditions begin to improve, they start to move toward the source. This is why healthy gardens almost always have earthworms living in the soil. They are drawn to places where organic material and microbial life are active. Now imagine what happens when you suddenly introduce a concentrated burst of those conditions into a patch of soil that previously had none. The microorganisms multiply quickly. The organic compounds in the liquid begin breaking down into smaller nutrients. The soil becomes softer and easier to move through. To an earthworm searching for food, this suddenly becomes an attractive place to explore. Around the 48-hour mark, something interesting usually begins to appear. Small holes start forming on the surface of the soil. These holes are the entrance points, where worms have begun pushing upward through the ground. If you gently move the soil with your fingers, you may start to see the first signs of movement. Thin reddish bodies sliding through the darker earth, slowly working their way around the moist area. Earthworms rarely arrive all at once in a dramatic explosion, but when conditions are right, they can appear surprisingly quickly. And when multiple worms begin exploring the same patch of improved soil, the difference becomes obvious. The ground that once felt like compacted dust starts to break apart more easily. The tunnels they create allow oxygen to move deeper into the soil. Water begins to travel through those pathways instead of sitting on the surface or running away. But the most important part of what worms do is something even more fascinating. As they move through the soil, They swallow small amounts of earth mixed with organic matter inside the worm's digestive system. That material is transformed. The microorganisms continue breaking down organic compounds, while the worm processes the material physically. When it leaves the worm's body, it becomes something called worm castings, a rich, nutrient-packed substance that plants absolutely love. Worm castings are not just fertilizer. They are a biological improvement to soil structure. They help bind particles together into stable clusters that hold moisture while still allowing air to circulate. This combination creates one of the best possible environments for plant roots to grow. That is why gardeners around the world consider earthworms one of the most valuable allies in any garden. They do the work of aerating, fertilizing, and restructuring soil continuously without any machinery or chemicals. But worms only stay where conditions support them. If the soil dries out again or loses its organic content, they simply move somewhere else. That is why the liquid poured on this soil matters so much. It acts like a starting signal for the entire ecosystem beneath the surface. The microorganisms begin the process. The worms follow, and together they start rebuilding the soil into something living again. This process may seem almost magical if you have never seen it before, but it is actually one of the most natural cycles in the world. In forests, fields, and natural ecosystems, organic material constantly falls to the ground. Leaves drop from trees. Plants die and decompose. Animals leave behind waste, and microorganisms immediately begin breaking everything down. Over time, that material becomes part of the soil itself, feeding plants and supporting countless forms of underground life. Modern gardening sometimes interrupts that cycle by removing organic matter or relying heavily on synthetic fertilizers that feed plants, but not the living ecosystem in the soil. When that happens, the soil slowly loses its biological activity. It becomes compacted, dry, and less capable of supporting healthy plant growth. But the encouraging part of this story is that soil can often recover faster than people expect. By reintroducing organic matter, moisture, and beneficial microorganisms, you restart the processes that nature has been using for millions of years. That dark liquid poured on the soil is simply a concentrated form of that process. It carries life in microscopic form and spreads it across the ground. Once the conditions are right, the rest of the ecosystem begins to respond naturally. Within a few days, the difference can already be noticeable. The soil becomes easier to dig. The surface may stay moist longer. After watering, small insects and organisms begin appearing where there were none before. And of course, the presence of earthworms becomes the most visible sign that the soil is changing. Over the following weeks, their activity continues improving the soil structure. Plants growing in that environment often develop stronger roots and more stable growth because the soil is no longer just a container for nutrients. It has become a living system again. This is one of the reasons experienced gardeners often say that healthy soil grows healthy plants. Instead of constantly feeding plants from the outside, they focus on feeding the soil ecosystem that supports everything else. Once that system is functioning properly, it begins doing much of the work on its own. The worms continue digging tunnels. The microorganisms continue breaking down organic material. The soil gradually becomes darker, richer, and more capable of holding water and nutrients. What started as a patch of lifeless dirt slowly transforms into something that can support a productive garden again. And the fascinating part is that this transformation did not require expensive fertilizers or complicated treatments. It began with something simple: a dark liquid full of microscopic life poured onto the surface of the ground. Within 48 hours, the first signs appeared. Worms began exploring the improved environment, responding to the new food sources and moisture in the soil. That moment is often the turning point when a gardener realizes that the soil is not truly dead. It was simply waiting for the right conditions to bring it back to life. When those conditions appear, nature responds quickly. Life returns in layers, starting with the smallest organisms and gradually building toward the larger creatures that help shape the soil itself. Watching that process unfold reminds us that soil is not just dirt beneath our feet. It is one of the most complex and important ecosystems on the planet, supporting plants, animals, and ultimately the food we depend on every day. Sometimes all it takes to begin restoring that ecosystem is a small action that reintroduces life into the ground. And once that life begins working again, the soil often knows exactly how to heal itself.